Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt serfs, peasants, vassals, minion meat sacks. I'm Useful welcome. And my bread and butter doing Useful Idiot over the last 10 or so years, maybe even 15 years, was doing historical context. Because for me, that's really important. And I think history tells us a lot. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it rhymes. And so I would decided I would do a quick overview, and it'll be a very quick, succinct overview of tariffs in the United States. And I would really hope that Trump and his advisors would bone up a little bit on the history of tariffs. I think they're a little misguided. For one thing, tariffs used to be a lot more effective in the era pre-globalization when you had industrial giants around the world competing, and there was more sovereign nations. And now with globalization, with all our economies and nations uh, intrinsically entangled, it becomes a lot more complex. But let's get right down to the history a little bit. So in the 19th century, 95% of government revenue was from tariffs. And by World War I, 31% of the United States government revenue came from tariffs. So that signaled a change. And that substantiates what I just said, that during the 19th century, when you had sovereign nations all over the globe competing economically, it was really easy to target other nations with tariffs and generate a lot of revenue. And the entanglements weren't quite so deep. And also, each nation had specialties. And so each nation had its economic strengths to compete in the global market. But now we have globalization where nations all over the world are competing in similar arenas because their economies expanded to encompass a lot of things that weren't traditionally part of those regions. And it's no surprise that by World War I, 30% of revenue was created by tariffs. And because just before World War I, of course, we had the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, as well as the creation of an income tax. So tariff revenue could easily be replaced by taxes coming in. But the history goes back further than that. There was a Tariff Act of 1789 championed by Alexander Hamilton under George Washington, and there was a 5% tariff on all imports. And so I say, this goes back to the very creation of this country. And of course, we know a lot of things about tariffs had a lot to do with starting the revolution, the economic issues between Britain and the United States and the colonies. But they leveled tariffs under George Washington. This will sound very familiar, to promote trade, to raise revenue, and to protect U.S. economic operations, including manufacturing. And so during the Civil War, one of the big causes of the Civil War that's not really talked about a lot is the fact that the North was all about tariffs and the South was not about tariffs. And so the whole states' rights issues were divided along a bunch of different lines, but one of them is the fact that the North liked tariffs and the South didn't. And that makes sense too, because the North, of course, was industrialized and wanted to have income coming in, promote trade, and protect U.S. manufacturing, whereas the South was agricultural. And so the tariff system didn't really apply to the South as much. And so, as I pointed out, in the early 1900s, we had industrial expansion and income tax. There was a lot less need for tariffs. And we had problems moving forward. And this is one of the things that's kind of mind-boggling about the fact that Trump points out what a great hero McKinley was and how effective tariffs were, because when you look at history, this just isn't true. After the 1929 crash under President Hoover, they created the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and they put import duties of 20% to protect American businesses, and particularly farmers. And of course, Europe retaliated, and a lot of people suggest that this exacerbated the crash and the depression, and there seems to be a lot of truth to that, because U.S. European trade declined by 2/3 as a result of these tariffs. So hardly something that Trump should be touting as some kind of economic savior. And this is a great example. You start unleashing these trade wars, and you end up creating economic calamity on a global scale, particularly when we're talking about economic partners like Canada and Mexico. And so U.S.-European trade declined by 2/3. And so at the end of World War II, tariffs decreased substantially, and there was what was created was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which directly led to the creation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, where they would try to balance out the tariff system on a global scale. And in some respects, it was pretty effective. But now we're in an era of free trade, and the whole idea of reintroducing 18th and 19th century ideas about tariffs is really not appropriate. We live in a free trade world, and like I talked about before, now we have economies that are completely entangled, and nations aren't near as sovereign, and economies all over the world have expanded and gone into territories they didn't initially do. A good example of that is China. Of course, they weren't a component of the global economy for a long time, and now they lived backwardly, to put it in simple terms. And it's only been recently that they now compete on the global market in technology and automobiles, robotics, automation, all kinds of things. So that's added a whole new quotient to a world global system where tariffs become complex. And the one area that I do agree with Trump on tariffs, of course, is our competition with China. And they have an entire array of pretty substantial tariffs on U.S. products to protect their industries. And Trump in the United States have had tariffs on China for a long time. He just raised them another 10%, which is a fairly small amount. And so far, China's just absorbing it. There's going to be some retaliatory tariffs, but Americans in general, smartly, are pretty much on board with tariffs with China, and that makes the most sense. But once again, when you go back to 1789, the whole idea of tariffs was to promote trade, raise revenue, and protect U.S. manufacturing. And here we are in the 21st century, and we hear the same things. We want to bring back jobs that are lost, protect U.S. manufacturing, tariffs on countries with tariffs on U.S. imports, and to address balanced trade deficits, address and balance trade deficits. And of course, one of the things in the modern age is the intellectual property theft. That's another reason why tariffs with China seem a lot more appropriate, because there's a huge amount of intellectual property theft with China and U.S. technology, and so that's a problem. So once again, tariffs seem very appropriate when we're talking about China. But China costs the U.S. 200 to 600 billion dollars annually because of this trade imbalance and their tariff system. So it's not a substantial amount of money in the scheme of things, but still, I still think it's very appropriate to address tariffs. And I think Trump's being smart right now. Apparently, he's backing off from tariffs for a few months to analyze a little further. And they're talking about something I've touched on in this video, the whole idea of reciprocal tariffs. We will basically go tit for tat. If countries have tariffs on the U.S., then we will impose tariffs on them on a case-by-case basis, and that seems to be smart. And I'm glad to see Trump backing off a little bit on this whole tariff idea. And it's also interesting too, historically, to look at the patterns for the United States between 1861 and 1933. We had the highest tariffs on imports in the world, 50%. And as I pointed out, between that period, we have an industrial revolution, and we have the introduction of the Federal Reserve and income taxes, and the whole idea that we had 50% tariffs on imports from around the globe is an insane amount. And between 1790 and 1860, the years before that, the tariffs varied from 20% to 60% to 20%, depending on what was going on geopolitically in the world. So we do have a history of very, very, very high tariffs. So the tariffs we're talking about now certainly aren't in that vicinity. But looking back through history, we find out that these kind of high tariffs uh, do exactly what critics have warned them are going to happen. We're going to have trade wars. We're going to have a drastic decrease in world trade, and that's a no-brainer. And and it could lead to inflationary forces. Although one thing I've looked into is the fact that inflationary forces from tariffs are not immediate. The kind of inflation caused by tariffs is something that unfolds slowly. So the idea that inflation is going to be a dramatic thing we're going to see right up front, and I could be wrong. We're definitely going to see increases on a lot of prices immediately. The current tariffs that we have, that Trump just put on aluminum and steel, we're going to see the results of that fairly quickly, because of the use of steel and aluminum affects quite a few industries and quite a few economically important industries. But altogether, the kind of inflation caused by tariffs is something that will unfold slowly and will be relatively easy to absorb. But I go back to my main point. I think Trump's idea that tariffs are quick and easy, as he said, simply isn't true. And the use of tariffs is not going to replace the income tax in the United States like he claimed. But I'm glad to see him being a little more pragmatic now. He's backed off on these tariffs with Canada and Mexico for the time being. He's still looking at tariffs on Europe, and he's instigated tariffs on China. And so far, we're not feeling any effects. But I'm glad to see him take a pragmatic look, and it's nice to see him getting some outside advice on this now. And apparently, he's getting good advice. Five Republican senators have just come out and called for him to take a closer look at tariffs, and are asking a lot of big questions. And so that's a good thing. I think the whole idea that Trump has about tariffs is from a bygone era, and we really need to look at them closely and do it on a case-by-case basis, and that looks like the direction he's moving. But history tells us a lot, and I think Trump needs to look a little closer at history, and McKinley is hardly a tariff hero, as he likes to place him as some kind of hero. And tariffs are just as volatile and problematic when McKinley instigated them as they would be now. So there we have a little history lesson. Thanks for watching. I'm Useful Idiot. Don't you be one too.